sex work, they in movies like Pretty Woman, they glamorize it, right? But it could also make you feel really dehumanized, and it can affect your mental health because you're engaging in these behaviors with these people that you wouldn't normally want to, and it affects you on a spiritual level, who you get an emotional bond with, you fall in love with them, and the next thing you know, oh, if you love me, go out there and get this money for us, make sure we're good. Especially with this generation, I feel like lots of times we turn to friends and other things because we don't necessarily feel supported and heard by our parents. Me actually consciously becoming aware of the pattern and saying, I don't want to keep doing this anymore. So I graduated summa cum laude. I had started going to college to be a pediatrician. So I was taking biology, pre-med, and my life kind of turned around into the whole opposite direction because our parents were parented a certain way. And when you're going through and you're the one in your lineage to trying to like change that cycle in a certain way, you have to.
Hey y'all, welcome back. My name is Lajoie, and this week we have our guest Yasmeen, a really good friend of mine, and an amazing, incredible poet. And today she's going to talk about her transformation journey and how she plans to expand. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into it. Yasmeen is a spoken word artist and author of the book Goddess Soul Speaks. Her work has been published with organizations like Stolen Youth and the University of Washington School of Social Work. She performs her poetry around the community for organizations including the Seattle Urban Indian Health Institute, Vocal Washington, North Seattle College, and the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, Seattle. Her writing reflects her experience with challenges like sexual abuse, domestic violence, mental health, addiction, and homelessness. She's a community activist and advocate for the Lived Experience Coalition of Washington, working to dismantle barriers to end homelessness. Yasmeen is also an entrepreneur with a business as a Reiki practitioner, and she's becoming a sacred sexual healer for women. Yasmeen is using her experience to bring awareness to these social justice issues and using her voice to find solutions. So everybody, please welcome Yasmeen to the show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful, Lajoie. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being on here. Thanks for being a guest on this show. And as you know, this is a show about transformation and expansion, learning from our experiences where we have transformed our lives in some way, and then expanding upon that and seeing, really truly seeing how our souls can really grow through the human experience. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Yasmeen's experience with her transformation. And we're going to go ahead and start off with the one major transformation that she's had so far in her life. So let's get into it.
Okay, so one of my major transformations I've had in my life was actively escaping the life of sex trafficking. I was in the life for quite a few years. I ended up in that space and I just wanted to bring awareness to it. I was able to meet at Lajoie, a women's group. She's a volunteer at the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, and they've been pivotal in helping me change my life. One of the things I wanted to say about the situation, I think people kind of don't really understand how all the things are interconnected, like childhood trauma, abuse, drug addiction, homelessness can lead to human trafficking. So that's been one of my major transformations. I was in the life, I was trafficked by a few gentlemen, and I was able to escape that life through the help of organizations and just really knowing that that wasn't what my soul was supposed to be doing on this planet.
Yeah, and so how did that experience with human trafficking, how was that a catalyst for your transformation?
It was a catalyst for my transformation because originally, when I was younger, I endured some sexual abuse and I was pretty much groomed to be in that lifestyle. And when I was 18, I was scheduled to go to college, and I went from being in that space to being in a space where I've been trafficked. It really catalyst to change my life because I knew from the beginning that I've always been talented at a lot of different things. And that's not something that people think that they would end up in doing. That definitely wasn't my plan when I wrote the list of things that I wanted to be, but I realized through certain things that happened in the system how I ended up in that life. And my catalyst for changing was wanting to be a different person because I didn't resonate and align with how I felt. One of the things I want to explain to people as I'm writing in this new poem that I wrote called The Crack in the System, and it basically talks about how all the things that we experience are interconnected, right? And I would often ask my higher power, like, why am I going through these things? Why did I have to experience that? And it's because I could check every box on the book now and know what's helping to transform people's lives and where people are falling through the cracks. So one of the things I said in that was, I was in the life, wasn't doing it like that. And then I met a guy who I thought was fly, and now he beats me and makes me cry. And so I flee to save my life, but then I end up in the life. And there's a connection between homelessness and human trafficking. And in my book, God is Soul Speaks, I talk about how a lot of the systems that we're enduring and living in don't really allow you to be able to transform out of those situations. They kind of perpetuate it. For example, housing isn't very affordable, right? We don't have affordable housing. And then there's so many barriers in place. And that's kind of the work I also do with the Lived Experience Coalition. I bring my perspective as someone who's been in the life and tried to get out several times. And it takes just like a village to raise a child, it takes a village to escape that life. And transformation for me meant doing and using my natural talents of what I could do to be a better person and be who was more in alignment with my spirit. When I was going through the life, I struggled with a lot of different things, including coping with trauma by way of addiction. And so transformation came from realizing that I'm worth more than what I was feeling in my spirit. Sometimes you get discouraged, and like I wanted to explain to people, they think as far as sex trafficking or sex work, it might be someone walking the street. It could be survival sex for a place to sleep and food to eat too. A lot of people are engaging in that and they don't even realize that they're in that lifestyle. And I really think it's because of a lot of systematic barriers that are in place that are keeping us from transforming and being our higher selves because we're stuck in survival mode for so long. And so I had to say, I got to get out of survival mode because I know I'm meant to do more than just be in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, said a lot. Okay, so when it comes to some of the systematic barriers that you experience, what were those, if you don't mind talking about them? And because it seems like even from my own experience, there's a lot of systematic barriers that come into place when it comes to our aspirations, our dreams, right? There's a lot of not just red tape, but it seems like there's a lot of obstacles. And sometimes it really takes for us to start to overcome those obstacles in order to start to kind of get into that momentum where we're transforming. So a lot of obstacles that are put in place right now is like those systematic barriers. So what were some of the first systematic barriers that came into place that kept you in that life? And then what was the point where you started to overcome those barriers where you're like, oh, wait, let me take this step forward. Let me go around this barrier, or let me go over it, or let me just push it to the side. 'Cause sometimes that's what we got to do. What was the point where that change occurred?
Yeah, so a lot of systematic barriers. I think one of the things that people fail to realize about people who are experiencing homelessness, they kind of just think, "Oh, you're lazy, you're going through that," but they don't realize how we got to that point. A lack of living wages is definitely something that's impactful. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, then it's hard to be able to save money to be able to get housing. And if something happens and you're not working, it's easy to lose your housing, right? And another barrier that I experience is just how the system is when it comes to helping people out of that space of being in poverty, right? So for me, at one point in time, after I had got out of life and I was like working independently, I wasn't being trafficked by a pimp, but I was working independently. I had saved up thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and moved over from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I couldn't get affordable housing because they wanted you to have a job and pay stubs and rental history. They want you to make 3 times the rent. Just so many different things that if you're coming from homelessness or even coming from trafficking, you may not have those resources available. And what I found to be an obstacle and barrier, they're like, oh, well, these are the rules and we can't break it. You have to have this, you have to have this, you have to have that. And so what really helped me was meeting with certain organizations that would advocate on my behalf, because I would tell them what I needed and what would be good for me to be able to get back into stable housing. At one point in time, I was working a full-time job while living in my car. So it wasn't that I wasn't willing to work. It was just it's hard to hold down a job if you don't have a place to come home every night and sleep, and food to eat. Even if you're getting food stamps, you don't have a kitchen to cook in. So there's just so many different barriers, and a lot of their rules. I remember at one point in time they said that I was making $12 over the limit to be able to receive food stamps. And I'm like, yeah, $12. And so I just think in general, there's just so many obstacles put in place, and people don't necessarily considering the underlying things that we're experiencing that are keeping us at these lower levels. Like you said, there's obstacles. Sometimes you got to move them to the side. Sometimes you got to face them and say, look, this is what's not working. This is what is working. And a lot of times they would say, oh, well, these are the income limits and this is what the law says. And I noticed that they weren't necessarily making exceptions in situations where they could have made exceptions. There's so many women that I've met that have been in and out of life that wanted to get out, that wanted a desire to do something else, right? But they weren't given the proper support because they didn't have a certain amount of time clean, or even just different variations of the same story, right? And it was really difficult for me to be able to transform into who I knew I wanted to be, because I kept on having these barriers. And then when you get those barriers and you're being told these things about you, it kind of becomes belittling at a certain point. For example, after I had got out of the life, my daughter was 2 and I was working to try to find a new place to live. And because I did have a prostitution charge on my record, I had got hired at a popular insurance company, and I went to go start, and then they said, well, actually we did a background check and found that you had this prostitution charge, and so unfortunately we're not going to be able to hire you because prostitution is a crime of moral integrity, which in turn put me back in that space. And as I was saying, it kind of reminds me of that song by City High, like, what would you do if your son was at home crying all alone on the bedroom floor because he's hungry, and the only way to feed him is to sleep with a man for a little bit of money. And in one of my poems, Pussy Power, I often talk about how the music and stuff that we listen to encourages those things, but if you've actually been in that lifestyle, then you become shamed for it. So one of the obstacles was getting out of my own way and saying, yeah, this is what I experienced, this is what happened to me, but that's not necessarily who I am. And a lot of times we begin to identify with our labels, right? So then we're like, oh yeah. And I remember getting that charge. I had been in a situation, and it was actually the first Black woman judge that I had, and she said, I'm dismissing these charges on the interest of justice because you're a victim of human trafficking. A lot of people don't even necessarily realize that there's just different types of things, whether you're engaging in survival sex for a place to stay, or what they call Romeo pimping, when you have a partner who you get an emotional bond with, you fall in love with them, and the next thing you know, oh, if you love me, go out there and get this money for us, make sure we're good. And so many people are going through these different experiences, and when I share, people are like, aren't you scared to talk about that and stuff? It's going on all the time, whether or not we acknowledge it or not. And I think just the systematic barriers as far as rental history, employment history, just different things like that they could make exceptions for. I had to go through certain channels and certain programs to be able to get off the street and into my first housing. And I was luckily able to do that because I was a victim of commercial sexual exploitation. And so they had special programs and special places for me to be able to have to go to a shelter and then eventually get permanent housing.
And so what did those programs, well, actually, what led you to even go to these programs that really helped you transform your life? what was like the moment where you were like, oh, let me check this out, or let me go to this program? What was that moment that made you decide to start choosing to be in those programs that would help?
Yeah. It was a moment. I When I was working on the East Coast, it was a lot different. And then coming over here, I had the money. I was spending money in hotels for places to stay, still having to actively engage in sex work to be able to get money to stay at the hotels, and just like the level of disassociation it takes to be able to do that. I was, using drugs to cope with the trauma of it, and it just got to the point where I said enough is enough. Like, I can't do this anymore, and I need to reach out and see if there are organizations that are going to be able to help us, because I know I'm not the only one who's experienced that. I've met several women who've been in those same situations, and they feel like there's no way out, right? That there's no support. And so what really dawned on me was, I have to be willing to show that this is something I'm willing to let go of, because it does affect you. Sex work, they in movies like Pretty Woman, they glamorize it, right? But it could also make you feel really dehumanized, and it could affect your mental health because you're engaging in these behaviors with these people that you wouldn't normally want to, and it affects you on a spiritual level. And my spirit just said, I can't do it anymore. Like, I need something better. When I was in high school, I graduated summa cum laude. I had started going to college to be a pediatrician, so I was taking biology pre-med, and my life kind of turned around into the whole opposite direction. And I knew that's not the space I was supposed to be in. And it just really took a lot of willpower to be able to say, first of all, I'm going to be vulnerable and ask for help in these situations, and what organizations do provide assistance for people who are trying to escape the life. So that was one of the major things. Not only that, it was difficult when I was going through homelessness and trafficking to be with my child. And I had a desire to be a better mom and be with the person who was the most important person to me. And so that was motivation for me to be able to say, okay, enough is enough. I need to be able to go ahead and do something else, because this is not working with me. It's not in alignment with how I felt.
Yeah, and I feel like for a lot of us who are on any journey of transformation, right? We get to this point where we start to acknowledge the cycle that we're in, right? We start to acknowledge that, oh my God, I've been doing this for years. And for some of us, opportunity comes that's showing us like, hey, you don't have to be living this life anymore. Here's, an organization, here's a friend, here's a family member, here's somebody who, or some organization that will support you to get out of that life, or to get out of that cycle, that mentality. But it starts with awareness, right? It starts with the awareness that it's like, oh, I've been doing this over and over and over again, and nothing's changing. And it's like, you want to get to that point where you have to acknowledge that nothing's changing, and you have to start to have the willpower, like you said, to change. If you don't have that willpower, it's going to be very difficult, if not somewhat impossible, to change, right? It's one of those things where it's like, you can't have anybody force you to do anything. You got to be willing to do it for yourself. At the end of the day, you got to be
Exactly.
willing to say that I love myself enough to get out of this. I love myself enough to see a change, right? To be my best
Yeah.
self, to be the best version of me. So real quick for the
And
audience.
also too,
Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
no, I just wanted to add with that too, because I know a lot of people advocate and they say sex work will be easier or better if it's legal and stuff like that. For me, from my experience, like, supply and demand, right? So if it becomes legal, then there's going to be a need for more girls and women, or boys even, and it's going to create that cycle. So part of that was bringing awareness to, okay, this is actually kind of being more detrimental to me, because fast money, isn't always good money. And I know that I have these skills and things that I grew up with that I'd be better at doing than that. And so, like you said, it did take an awareness and then a desire to want to change for the better. And I feel like sometimes a lot of people get comfortable in that space. And so they're like, I could do that. But also for me too, I experienced discrimination in sex work as well, not only from different races of women being more valued, but like even being a darker skinned woman, and so I realized like this is affecting me. It's making me feel devalued, and I don't have to do this anymore, and I just had to be willing to get out of that space.
Mhm. Was there a point of because what I'm hearing is self-love. So what was there something that happened that really empowered you to start changing your relationship with yourself, changing your relationship with how you love yourself and how you view yourself?
Yeah,
So
I think for me, what it was, huh?
I need to charge my laptop. Sorry.
Okay, okay.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I think for me, what it was is not wanting my worth to be monetized, of how much money I can make and who is desiring me. I felt like it took me loving those parts of me that felt unloved and like accepting those parts and kind of integrating that into my life. That was enough for me to say, okay, I deserve something better than this. A lot of people, and as I'm writing in my new book, The Crack in the System, I feel like sometimes when we get these labels and we go through these situations and we're not given the help that we need when we're crying out for help or reaching for help, it makes you feel desensitized and dehumanized and just kind of like, oh, okay, the world just doesn't care about me. And that's not really true. And so we begin to believe those things in our head. Like one of the things, I have a poem that writes about disassociation, and we all do it in different ways, right? But if you've experienced a lot of trauma from childhood all the way out through adulthood, and then you're still experiencing this type of thing, you kind of disassociate from your environment to be able to survive, to get through. And so then it was like becoming aware of those and then trying to integrate it without judgment. And it's hard, right? Because we could be very judgmental against ourselves and other people, but it really took a space of just being cognizant and aware that I love myself more than how I'm treating me. I love myself than more what I'm allowing. The same thing when I was in abusive relationships, and oh, I can't live without you. I'm gonna unalive myself if I don't have you, blah blah blah. And it was like, okay, I stayed in this abusive relationships, both physically and verbally abusive. And then it got to the point where this is not love. And sometimes if you don't have like that modeled behavior growing up, you kind of accept certain things that you normally wouldn't tolerate. And so it had to be able to kind of connect. And if I'm being honest, it was like more or less when I started doing a lot of self-reflection and really understanding the pattern and seeing the pattern and saying, okay, I need to change this. But how can you change something if you don't realize that you have a problem, right? That's part of the issue. Sometimes we don't really acknowledge like what we're doing and how it's detrimental to our health. And so I had to make a decision, and I started meditating more, and I would get visions of my higher self doing all these incredible things, and I was like, I can't do this if I'm going to stay in this lower vibration in this state and feel like, oh, I can't do anything. Just reprogramming those limiting beliefs was definitely something that was ideal in my transformation. So
Yeah, I mean, you have to. I think it's necessary for anyone's transformation. You have to address the limiting beliefs. You have to address not just the limiting beliefs, but the root of where they come from. And 9 times out of 10, I would even say 10 times out of 10, it's not even from us.
yeah.
It's usually from either our parents or that one person that we met when we were kids who told us this one thing and it just kind of stuck with us, right? Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I'm willing to say 10 times out of 10, it's not even from us. But
Exactly. And
Mhm.
oh, sorry.
No, no, go ahead.
No, I was saying because when you said that, in a poem that I wrote, when I had not been able to go to college for that semester and I came over here, I was told, well, you're a woman, so you should never be broke because you're sitting on gold. Know the power of the PUSSY is what I was told, which automatically creates a thought that, okay, if people are going to be engaging with me like that, I should be getting paid. And that wasn't something that came from me naturally. That wasn't something that came from me. So it came from an outer source, but then I've been able to kind of internalize it, right? So it's definitely, like you said, sometimes it'd be outside influences that make you have those limiting beliefs. And I basically challenge those beliefs. And it's like, I'm more than that, like more than what you made of me, right?
Um, yeah, and I love so sorry. So let's pause real quick. So when you said the power of the PUSSY, right? Can you say that quote or the quote from your poem one more time real quick, and I'm gonna expand upon it.
Yeah. So when I was 18, I was told I should never be broke because I'm a woman and I'm sitting on gold. Know the power of the PUSSY is what I was told. Creating a thought that I was supposed to have it being available to be bought and sold, right? And then in the poem it goes on, now ladies, before you go on judging me, realize that we are like, as Cardi B said, broke boys don't deserve no pussy. I know that's right. You know, so the music that we listen to and the culture that we grow up in kind of promotes and encourages prostitution. But then when you actually live that life, then you're kind of shunned, like, oh, you was just, it's really, it's really crazy when you think about it. Cause it's like, I don't know about you, but in the poem, I talk about certain specific artists that I listened to growing up, like Salt and Pepper saying, if she want to be a freak and sell it on the weekend, you know, and Lady Marmalade saying, you know, why spend mine when I can spend yours? It's just like a whole bunch of different influences that kind of reinforce that thought, right? So that's where that came from. But yeah, it came from a family member who told me that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's not just like from anywhere, right? It's especially from Black women. Like the industry does a really great job. Even to this day, you can see, you know, the way Black artists dress versus the way these white artists, like pop artists dress is very different. It's literally day and night. Like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's really crazy.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's obviously a lot of intention in that, okay, because they know the
Mm-hmm.
power that we have as Black women and they want to suppress that. But my point is what I want to say about that quote is I feel like there's another dimension to this, right? It's not just on the surface how, you know, our pussy can be bought and sold. I feel like yeah, usually don't cuss on here, but I guess this is gonna be the exception. But usually, you know, it's there's truth to it. Our power does come from our pussy. It does come from, you know, our ability to birth life. You know, it comes from our ability to create infinitely, right? It comes from this power that we had as women, and especially as Black women. And so I guess I wanted to take a moment to really reframe that thought. So comparing, I guess not comparing, but think about, you know, Yasmeen when she was young, when she first heard that quote to Yasmeen now, how would you reinterpret that quote?
Um, I would reinterpret it in a way of, instead of thinking like that's shake your money maker or use what you got to get what you want, to be able to use that in a sacred way and to be able to engage with people who are going to appreciate you, not necessarily put a monetary value on you, because then you know, in my poem it says, you know, it could be hard to believe that your worth is more than monetary when sex buyers can order you off the menu like some commissary. And that's how it becomes. So like reframing that thought, if I had to, well, I actually do talk to young women about it too, it would be like, don't worry about who's going to pay you and do all that stuff. Be independent and get your own stuff together. And I understand that, you know, like it says, like we live in a world with the model of sex sells, right? But then you sell sex and then you're treated differently. I would reframe it in a way of just knowing your own power and the sacredness of that power, because there's a lot of sacred things that we could birth from that. And you know, back in the day, like long time ago, they actually had like sacred prostitution or tantric work that was more spiritually focused, not monetarily focused. And I think that's one of the things that people should really differentiate, because it doesn't make you necessarily feel good because someone's going to pay all this money for you. You know, it for me personally, it made me feel better knowing my worth, and okay, I don't have to engage in this behavior anymore because it doesn't align with my spirit and what I want to do with myself. So
Mm-hmm.
that was one big transformation. And just to give encouragement, because I know there's a lot of people who have tried to get out of the life, and they're like, oh, well, a square job isn't paying enough. Da, da, da. Do what you're inherently know to do. Like, what are your natural talents, right? And that's kind of where the transformation came. In my book God is Soul Speaks, I've been writing poetry since I was literally like 7 years old. So it includes poetry that I wrote when I was younger, and I realized like I had a talent with words and writing. So instead of focusing on that, use my experience to be able to bring light to that situation, but also use my talents behind it. And that's why I was, hired by these different organizations, and, sharing my art with them, because there's other people out there that are experiencing it too. And they don't necessarily know that they have worth that is not necessarily what's the word I'm looking for? Because we're kind of conditioned sometimes, right, to think a certain way, like, oh, I just got to get the money, and not necessarily think about the long term effects of it, and something like sharing your experience, writing a book, then it expands you into a whole nother space where you don't have to be limited to being in that lifestyle that you were in. You could use your experience to not only educate others, but to also uplift yourself out of that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what the core of transformation is that uplifting, no matter where you're coming from, no matter how long you've been in certain cycles, whether it's years or decades, uplifting yourself, coming from a place of empowerment so you can get to where you see yourself, where you do deserve to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to transformation, what I've found through my experience is that a lot of people, well, when I transform, my circle transforms. And I don't mean that I'm bringing everybody with me, because I've tried that and it did not work. It did
Yes.
not work. It actually held me back. So when it comes to transformation, or your transformation specifically, obviously there are changes that you made to your life and that affected you in a positive way. How did it affect your friends or your family or your circle? Like how did it affect them, and how did they react?
From when I was in the life, or like my transformation out of that situation?
Your transformation
Because
out of, oh, actually both. It could be,
okay,
yeah.
okay, because when I was going through that, I found it very ironic, because my person who told me know the power of the PUSSY, when they found out that I was actually doing that, it was shame, and oh, we can't deal with you right now because you're doing these things. And it made me feel real isolated and really frustrated with just like not feeling that support and that love. But then I realized, you have to take it upon yourself to do better if that's what you want. And I'm not knocking anyone who wants to be a sex worker, stripper, all that. I know that, people will do whatever they want. But for me, the transformation out of that came from me actually consciously becoming aware of the pattern and saying, I don't want to keep doing this anymore. So that means like I went through a lot of hardships after that, of staying in shelters and being homeless and being in these situations. And I'm very thankful for the organizations that were able to help with that transformation, because one of the things that I love about the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, they meet you where you're at. So when I started out in the organization, as you know, when you were volunteering, I was in the life and I wasn't very cognizant and aware. I was just kind of going through survival mode, and it was really hard to just stay present and focused. And transforming out of that, they were very pivotal part of that, because it was okay, now we're getting you stable. Instead of you having to try to go ahead and get a date to get this money, we're able to help you with this, or we may not be able to help you, but here's this organization. And one of the things I feel like there needs to be more collaboration from these different organizations that are working together for a common goal, right? And that's kind of what I've experienced. Like, I know what organizations were helpful and what made me feel dehumanized and, had a whole bunch of hoops that I had to jump through. And then other ones that made me feel like, okay, yes, I can do this, because sometimes it's also not even sometimes, it's also changing your mental mindset instead of looking at relationships like, oh, how much can I get out of this situation? Like, okay, I don't want to be in a relationship like this. I want to work on loving all the parts of me that I felt I discarded or disassociated with growing up or whatever the situation was. And I feel like the support that I got, it changed a lot. When I was going through that situation, I didn't really have a relationship with my sisters or my mom or my brother, my close family. And a lot of that came from the shame and the stigma of what I had to do to maintain when I was in survival mode. And I felt very frustrated and angry because I was like, why am I not getting more support? Like, don't you guys see I'm struggling with this? But I also realized that everybody has their own life too, and sometimes when you're stressing people out, they want to kind of give you your space. So it took some time. And when I finally was like, okay, I'm not going to be in this situation anymore, I'm going to work to get out of this space, it really took a lot to be able to build those relationships back with my family. And no family's perfect, right? I understand that, but it really, a lot of the things that I've experienced, especially, some of the abuse that I endured, it was hard because I felt like that kind of shaped me into being groomed to be in these spaces to do the work that I ended up doing. And, when you're confronting your family about that, often causes a rift, and people are like, oh, you're talking about these things, we don't want to talk to you anymore. But that was my experience. That was my truth. So I said, I can't necessarily worry about pleasing everyone, because you do become a people pleaser and you want to just make other people happy, but then it affects you. And so part of that transformation of getting out was coming to a space where I felt supported unconditionally. And that's why I come to this space, because they've seen me at my worst and still love me. They see me at where I'm now and how I have transformed into not being that same person, but how I'm still growing and evolving through it and healing through it too. Like, one thing I know is healing isn't linear, right? I guess the other thing, like transforming from a lot of things go hand in hand. And in my book that I'm talking about, like the experience of any childhood trauma of any kind could cause you to like have, mental health inflictions, and then you're coping with trauma by way of addiction. I honestly believe that a lot of people that are out there using are not doing it because they really enjoy it, because they're numbing some pain and anguish that they're experiencing. And a lot of it comes from feeling abandoned, misused, just so many different things. And so it just really, I would say, now my relationship is better. The most important relationship now is with my child. Now we're able to, I'm able to be a mom again. And that took a lot, especially the whole situation with her father, escaping that situation and then like being like, okay, now what do I need to do to make sure you're okay? And really realizing how that affects people. I remember asking my baby, how am I as a mom? Like, how do you feel about me as a mom? What can I do to do better? And the conversation was very painful, but I realized it's not about me, right? This is me basically breaking a generational curse of not being able to discuss the parenting style or what's working, what's not working. And then when I was told what I was told, I said, okay, well, cool. I can go ahead and work on those things. And I can be cognizant and aware of how what I'm doing is affecting you, because I didn't necessarily get that growing up, right? I was the don't cry, I'll give you something to cry, or, not necessarily feeling emotionally supported in these situations. And so just trying to rebuild relationships with people, and you really have to show them too, like, I'm not on this anymore. I'm on a different vibration. I'm not trying to be in that space anymore. So I know you may have that thought of me of when I was in that space, but that's not where I'm at now. So
Yeah, and I think you
that makes
just,
sense.
yeah. I mean, I think you just defined, I guess in my opinion, we got to put it like that, in my opinion, what a good mom is, right? You went into that conversation and you took yourself out of it, so you were able to receive what your daughter needed. There are people who have mothers in their life, they never have the ability to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So in my opinion, you allowing yourself to be there for your kid, like that's a sign of a good mom, especially if there's other mothers listening to this, like take note. And I think that's really, sometimes we can't be there when we want to be, but to simply just show up when we know we can and when we know we have the ability to show up, that's what's important. And
One of the
it's
things my baby had said to me, I'm
Mhm.
sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I just think this is important. One of the things she said to me was, I was like, oh, I'm sorry, baby. I don't have all this money to take you out to go do all these things. And she's like, Mom, I don't want the money. I want more time with you. And that was like, okay, yeah, because sometimes we think throwing the gadgets and the gizmos at our kids really, is what they need, but really it's that quality time and being able to be in that space with them and let them be heard. What is it that you need from me? And I know, at least my generation growing up, we didn't have that type of open dialogue. It was like, okay, you got a problem, go deal with it. And not that I'm discrediting mothers who were in that space, but it took me realizing, like, at the end of the day, what you could be happy without all the material things if you have someone who loves and supports you unconditionally. And that's where I needed to shift my focus from, instead of worried about having all this money and buying all these things, just being there and showing up for the little things, and then be able to have that conversation. Like, okay, what did I do that was hurtful to you? And hearing that from your kid, it hurts you, but then it hurt me more to know that I inadvertently hurt my baby because that wasn't my intention, right? So I think it's definitely important to, especially with this generation, I feel like lots of times we turn to friends and other things because we don't necessarily feel supported and heard by our parents, because our parents were parented a certain way. And when you're going through and you're the one in your lineage to trying to, like, change that cycle in a certain way, you have to experience it yourself first and then realize what works and what doesn't work. So it's like I have a lot of respect for my mom because I understand what she went through and how it shaped her into the parent that she is. And instead of being angry and all that, I just come to a point of understanding some people may not be able to give you the love that you needed or even know your love language when it comes to parenting. And so just kind of being aware of that is important. Just as we're aware of, like, who our kids are hanging out with, it's to be aware of what their needs are. And when she said it's not the money that I need, it's you, that really sat with me. So
And girl, it sat with me too. Like, I teared up a little bit because I was like, oh my God, like, that's the truth. I think it's the truth that a lot of parents, they miss. No matter how much money they have. It's the part that they miss. It's like the kids, they want to spend time with them. And that's it. It's so simple. And not just, for the parents listening, but also for the individuals listening. You know, I always say, when you want to start with that journey of self-love, you got to start with that inner child, right? That inner child,
mm.
that's what the inner child wants. The inner child wants you to spend time with it. That's it. And quality time, right? Not, no, okay, I'm gonna text and I'm gonna meditate and I'm gonna, like, no, quality time. It's you and the inner child. That's it. Okay. Sitting with that, sitting in that energy. That's the work that needs to be done. That's the true work that I think can really help people transform their lives and really step into the new version of themselves. But you got to do the work, though. You got to do the work. It has to be intentional. It can't be half-assed. It
Yeah,
cannot be
yeah,
half-assed. That's
I
the
know.
truth. People
Yeah,
try to.
and it is definitely not easy too, because at least for me, like, growing up, it was easier for me to dissociate from some of the abuse and stuff that I experienced with, and just kind of go into my own little space and not really focus on what was happening. And like, oh, I can't wait till I get older and older. And then you don't realize you have, like, all these inner child wounds that are projecting into your life in different spaces, and that may be why you're in a relationship that isn't healthy, that's abusive, or something that you were used to. And so when I've sat and I've been working on my, like, I did an inner child journal, right? And so it took me reading the stuff that I wrote when I was little and just seeing, like, what made me feel good. I've always liked writing, I've always liked expressing myself through creative expression, through art of writing. And so when I got back to that, that's when I started to feel more in alignment. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, in my opinion, um, a lot of people don't necessarily do the things that they love, and that's why they're in spaces where they feel miserable in their jobs, or they're not really, you've been to that place with DMV and the
Mhm.
lady's got an attitude or whatever, or the DSS and the person's got an attitude with you, and you're like, why are you so angry with me? Like, It's because people are in these spaces because we're working for survival and not for thriving. And it's easier said than done, but just to kind of address those issues and what's working and what's not working, put you in a better space to be able to not only evaluate that, but like come to a different conclusion. And it takes a lot of healing, and healing is not linear. It's still doing it.
No,
But
it is not. Girl, that's what, yeah. That's like the one, there's like I'm making this list of like things that I wish people told me when I started this journey of healing and manifesting and being my future self.
yeah.
Um, yeah, healing isn't linear. Like, and that's the other thing too. There's a lot of people, they go to different countries, they do the ayahuasca, they see this like, really expensive therapist thinking that this one session is going to change their lives. And like the reality is that actually I got told many times and just didn't listen, chose not to listen because I wanted that, that pill, quote unquote pill, that I thought was going to change my life, that one fix. The truth is that that's not it. That's not healing. Like, I think if anything, those ceremonies, not just ceremonies, seeing the therapist, seeing a hypnotherapist, doing breath work, it can bring awareness to the issue, right? And it can help facilitate a portion of that healing, whether it's 20% of the healing or 80%. But there's still going to be that 10% that you got to do. You got to do the work at the end of the day. And that's the reality of it. And healing, I think the biggest thing about healing is that although, even I'm still one of those people who's like, I want it to be instant, like I want it to be done and done. The reality is that we live in this world of time, right? And so we have to experience healing over time. And there's gonna be times where you do really intensive healing, and then you're like, okay, that's enough healing for right now. I'm gonna take a break and then come back to it later. It's part of the journey. I think it's just part of the journey. It's part of experiencing what it means to be human. Um, and I just think it's so important to acknowledge that, because it's not something that happens overnight. I hate that. I don't know where this idea came from, but I have to admit, when I was in the beginning of my healing journey, that's what I believed. And I think that's what I was taught too. It's like one of those things that nobody ever said, but because they were trying to sell you on something or sell you on their product or whatever, they lead you to
Yeah.
convinced that this is, it's just a one-time thing. I just have to do this one session. I just have to do this one course. And it's just not the truth, right?
Right.
So I want to go back real quick to inner child work, because I think this is so important when it comes to our relationship with ourselves, right? What were some of the things, the aha moments where you were like, oh, this is what my inner child wants more of from me? Like what did you do to get to that point? And then what was it that you were like, oh wait, this is it. This is all I need.
I would say a lot of reflection and trying to better understand my psyche behind it. So, because of the things that I experienced growing up, I started using at the age of 12, started with marijuana, and then eventually I got into heavier drugs. And so I was just numbing a lot of different things. And it got to the point where I couldn't be on, I didn't want to be on drugs anymore. So I'm actually coming up on Saturday, it'll be 2 years clean on the 16th.
Yeah.
And
Congratulations.
thank you, and that came from a desire to want to do something differently, right? They say marijuana is a gateway drug. Trauma's a gateway drug as far as I'm concerned, right? Because what
Yeah.
affects you in your childhood could lead to, even if you don't use drugs, you may use people, places, or things, different things to kind of cope with it. And so getting to my inner child, I had to really sit a lot of times and cry and like, why am I crying? Why am I upset? What did I not feel like I had growing up, and how can I give that to my inner child now? And as I write about in my book, I said it was hard because you're grieving parts of you from your inner child because you didn't get to have the childhood that you wanted, or the career that you wanted, or things that didn't go your way, and you just often kind of internalize that. Like when you're told things verbal abuse really affects you a lot, because then you hear those voices in your head. So you're trying to get out of that space. And I think what it was sitting down and saying, what does my inner child like to do? So some days that look like scribbling on a paper and then writing. Writing is a very important thing, whether it be journaling or, writing a story or doing something like that. It's really what my inner child needed to be able to express itself in ways that I couldn't express myself growing up. Like I have the poem that I wrote called Violated. And as I was going through my artwork when I was a kid, I had made this mask, and it said, out the little bubble, it said, it really happened to me. And I remembered what happened to me, the abuse that happened to me, the sexual abuse, but I didn't want to acknowledge it in the story. So I just made that, it's almost like leaving little clues for yourself, right? And I realized, okay, that really happened to me, and I'm going to have to address this and work on forgiveness and letting that go, and understanding that it wasn't my burden to carry, because it doesn't make sense when you're going through these things, and you often kind of internalize it, and then it becomes a war that you're fighting within yourself. And your inner child wants love and healing and, comfort and to feel secure. But then my teenager wanted to rebel, and she was angry and all that. And then, like with my adulthood, I just want peace and quiet. And so what it really was is sitting down and having that reflection. One of the things you had mentioned as far as plant medicine goes, I'm a part of Adapt Law, which is addiction, depression, anxiety, plant medicine treatment. And I know a lot of people use ayahuasca and psilocybin, different plant medicines, because the pharmaceuticals weren't working for them. We all suffer with something, right? Whether it be depression, anxiety, and all those things. And it took me to understand that I wasn't on medications as a child. I didn't take my first medication until 2017, when I was well into adulthood. And I realized that that wasn't what was healing me. It was just kind of numbing me from the things that I needed to face and confront. And sometimes the things that we experience as children, not sometimes, they affect us and how our behavior is when we are adults, right? And it just really took a space of wanting to sit down with my inner child. I several books about inner child journaling and healing, what chakras are attached to that, really came from a space of doing that. And I think it's getting back to what you really love doing as a child, because before the world tells us who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do, we kind of inherently know, what our talents are and what we're good at. And I've always been good at helping people, and I've always been good at like writing and expressing. One of my favorite things that I love about legacy I created was when I was in middle school, I created the Young Authors Club, and it's still in place today, and that's a big thing, because I didn't have that growing up. And I was like, oh, well, we can get together and we can, be writers together. And so I definitely think it's about a lot of evaluation and forgiveness too, and it's so much easier said than done, right? Also, like forgiving yourself for things that you kind of internalized that weren't yours to internalize. Like, I can't help that I was touched at this age, that wasn't me doing it, but at the time it was why did you let them do that to you? And so of course then you're kind of internalizing like, oh, it's my fault I allowed that. And it shows up in behaviors when you're an adult. And just now with some of my friends that I have, instead of being like, oh, you're going to get in trouble, you can't do that, or why are you doing that with these boys and everything, talk to them and see where it's coming from. Because if you feel like you're going to get in trouble for something, you may not be willing to openly share what's going on, and then in turn you endure more years and years of abuse behind it. So I think that's really important, acknowledging like what your inner child loves to do is important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that you touched on the consequences, right? Like if I say what happened to me, or if I speak my truth in any way, I'm going to get punished for it. So therefore, I don't want to talk to anybody about it because I don't want to get punished. And then it kind of, it puts you in a space of fear. It puts you in a space of fear because now you feel like you can't express yourself. So who do you have to talk to? Yourself. So then you're going to, and yourself doesn't really know. I mean, yourself knows, but your ego doesn't know necessarily how to process that, right? So then you think about it, and then you think about it more and more. And then because you're thinking about it, you attract more of it. It's a really, it's a really dark cycle And I feel like, again, bringing awareness to that. Again, if there's parents listening, like, make sure to like create a space where you can listen. No comments, no consequences. No, just listen to your child. I think it's really important. And just listen. And for now, like, the key is going to be curiosity. Listen with curiosity. Don't criticize. That's it.
That's
But I think
important. Yeah.
if more of us knew how to do that, there would be a lot less traumatic cycles, is what I want to say. I think that's what's coming up, right? There would be a lot less cycling happening, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think you kind of touched on this before, and let me know if you need to go at any point. Because I think we're almost out of time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It flies by fast. But what was the second transformation in your life? And what were your realizations when the second transformation happened? Like, what did you realize about yourself?
The second transformation definitely came with me deciding to live a clean, sober life. It was something that I realized I had a problem with, right? And it wasn't helping the solution. I actually just shared my poem, The Addict's Antidote, with 265 students at a high school, and that was like a important moment for me, because one of the things I realized is I can't accomplish the things I want to do if I'm always in this induced state of euphoria or whatever. I think sometimes, like, we struggle with different things, and for me, what became alarming was I had started using drugs that were more potent than marijuana, and I was in that cycle of addiction going back and forth. And um I actually, there was a lot of harm done unintentionally in that space, because then I couldn't, show up for my friends, my family, my baby the way that I wanted to. And it really got to a space where I was staying in the space where I was using, so I couldn't really heal. I would make it a couple months, because I was homeless and I was living with a friend. I'd make it a couple months and then I would relapse, or even make it a year and then I go hang out with this friend and I would relapse again. And it really took me understanding the cycle of addiction and how it is a disease. I know people say, "Oh, it's a choice," but it is a disease, right? To be able to work on healing that. And so it became, well, why am I using? Oh, I'm using because I want to escape this feeling that I'm feeling in my reality right now. A lot of the use that came from it was when I was in active addiction and in the life. And, I do believe in plant medicine treatment. I'm not saying that it doesn't work for them, but for some people, especially if you're like hypersensitive to like spirituality and stuff like that, I realized it was taking me to a frequency that I was experiencing things that were undesirable, that I couldn't necessarily stop going through. And I decided one day, I said, okay, this is enough. I'm going to commit to not doing this anymore. And when I tell you, that's probably it has been the hardest transformation, because it's everywhere, right? Especially nowadays, you see people using on the streets and everything, and people look at them like, oh, that's just a dirty addict. And I look at them like, you're going through a lot of pain. You've experienced a lot of trauma. You've gone through a lot that you feel like you cannot cope without, by way of addiction. And it's important to kind of put your priorities in perspective, right? So when I finally was like, okay, I'm going to get clean. I don't need to use, because I would use for days on end. I wasn't eating well. I wasn't getting the sleep that I needed. I was cycling in and out of these systems and feeling just bad about myself, because it's like I knew inherently that wasn't my my spirit and what I really wanted to do, but I was coping with all these traumas and all these things that were happening by way of addiction. And it took me realizing how much that impacted me in the relationship with my family, my children, like that whole situation, when I said, okay, I have to be bigger than this. And once I got clean, I started to get a lot more clarity, right? Because sometimes you're not able to use even marijuana, they're like get high every day, but they don't realize that for some people it might bring you to a lower state where you're tired, you can't do anything, or you might be too overstimulated and you can't do anything either because you can't focus. And so then it became, okay, well, now we got you clean. Let's go ahead and write about it. Yeah, it's hard to talk about, but let's go ahead and write about it. And so when I wrote The Addict's Antidote, I said one of my lines is, the addict's antidote isn't spending a C note on dope, but to share your experience and strength and hope so others can just say no. Because you could be an example of, wow, we was out here using together and now you're what, going on 2-3 years, like you're getting the support that you need. That's a major transformation that's really hard to do, because like the endorphins and the feelings you feel when you're using, it kept me in a sense of euphoria, but realizing in hindsight that I was just kind of numbing everything down, and sooner or later it's going to come to the surface and you're going to have to address it. And that's the part that was difficult. And so as I was writing my book, I felt like I was going to relapse. I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And my higher power just kept on telling me, you can do this. You can do this, because you don't need drugs to be happy. You don't need drugs to numb yourself. And so then I started replacing it with different things like writing and meditating and resting, right? Just really trying to recuperate and get my brain back in a space where I could be able to function and have a conversation and not worry about, oh, do I need to go get high, or going through this whole situation. And they're really interchangeable, right? If you're experiencing homelessness and you don't feel like you have a lot of hope, you're like, fuck it, I'm going to use it. I don't care how much I use, because I don't want to be here anymore. And that's kind of the cycle of what people experience. And so it was more or less a willpower and a desire to not be an addict, to not be addicted to this substance that was destroying my life and the people that I loved, because that's not what we want to do. And sometimes with addiction, we don't realize how it affects our family and our people until they see you going through it, and then like coming out on the other side of it. Now it's like, oh wow, we're really proud of you, you're able to get through that. And it's a constant struggle. Every day is a struggle, right? But if I hadn't got clean, I wouldn't be able to write my book. I wouldn't be able to perform at these performances at open mics that I did, which got me discovered by certain agencies and got me hired to be a paid poet, like doing all these things. And so that's kind of where the expansion piece comes in, right? Expanding past those limited beliefs. If all I'm focused on is getting high or getting money and doing all this, I'm kind of blocking out different opportunities that could present themselves out of nowhere. And removing those limited beliefs, like, okay, yeah, I may have been on drugs, but I'm not necessarily going to be active all my life. That's why I say I'm in recovery, because I'm recovering from an illness. And I think it's important to be able to express yourself in a way that, I mean, I know when I share a lot of things, people come up to me, oh my gosh, your voice is so powerful, it's so powerful. And I think the power comes in, we always talk about light and love and sunshine and rainbows, but I think a lot of the power comes in those darkest times, because some of the best pieces I wrote were in my darkest times, because I've been there. So I know what that looks like. I know what that person is feeling, and it's a heightened sense of empathy and understanding. Like, instead of making you feel bad because you're using drugs, okay, have you had food today? Do you want to come take a shower? Do you want to just can I wash your clothes for you? Like, I did that for someone who I had been in a program with, and I saw him going all the way on the other side of that. And that's kind of where the crack in the system is coming from, because I feel like we're not holistically healing people. We're just medicating and numbing, and drugs is another form of that. And so getting out of that space and getting out of that mindset of that's where I want to use my time. Now, I understand a lot of people use it to cope, or even, for me to be able to slow down my thoughts sometimes, but I realize that it's not for everyone, just like everything's not for everyone. So my choice was to not do it, and it's been hard. And so I have my little pledge that comes up every day, why are you doing it? And my main reason is to be a better mother to my baby. Now I could show up to appointments and be there and call and check on you, make sure you're good. And even them moving back in my household, like, these are important things that I would not have if I was in active addiction. And I think that's one of the biggest transformations people could make, is from being on drugs into a sober living situation.
Yeah, going from addiction, and for many people this looks like many different things. I was saying the other day, like, we are all addicted to something. There's something that
Hmm.
we use to numb the feelings, the trauma, the experiences that we don't want to acknowledge. Everybody does this in different ways. Okay, so for the last question, I wanted to ask you, if there's one thing you could say to young Yasmeen, what would you tell her if you could talk to her right now?
I talk to her all the time,
Oh, well,
actually,
that's
and I do, because I have to go back and tell myself to forgive myself for the decisions I made when I wasn't in the state of where I needed to be in. Sometimes when you're in survival mode, including when you're in your childhood, and you don't want to get beat or you don't want to be going through this, so you kind of let them do whatever they're doing, to forgive yourself and kind of like release those energies, because you don't need to hold on to that, because then it makes you feel like you're inferior, kind of. And I tell her all the time, you are capable, you are loved, you are loved, you are an inspiration to yourself and others. You can do these things. And so when I get back into that space, because often my inner child comes up, and there's a lot of fear and stuff that comes up, like, a lot of people have like fear of death and stuff like that, like realizing that that's a part of life, then you start to live more boldly and more fearlessly and speak up. And so what I tell her, younger Yasmeen, I would tell her, just forgive yourself and don't internalize it. It's not your burden to carry. To transmute that into something positive. Some of the, like I said, the darkest times could lead to the most biggest blessings and the things that we experience. And it comes from like kind of acknowledging and realizing, yes, taking accountability for things, but then realizing some of the things you inherited, and it wasn't your trauma to store, and to really just love on yourself and be patient and forgiving and kind to yourself, because sometimes those voices, like how you said, like when you hear, in my poem I'm talking about, okay, yeah, in my poem I'm talking about, the voices I may hear may have been from outside sources, or kids taunting you when you're little, teasing you for different things, and to realize that people can only do so much. And so when I tell Yasmeen, like, you're capable of doing great things, and believe in yourself that you could do these great things, that's where I get my motivation and inspiration to keep going, because it's tough. And how you said we're all addicted to something, like I talk about that in my Addict's Antidote. Like, we are all addicted to something, whether it's money, shoes, clothes, food, sex, video games. Like, we're all addicted to something. So when you see that street addict, know it could have been you. And also to remember your growth, right? And growth isn't always linear. Just because we're aging in time doesn't mean that I'm not still growing my inner child and the strength of her to be able to show up for who I am now, because it takes a lot to heal and move forward. So.
I love how you said that. Oh my God, I need to like quote that and put it on my wall. But I love that you said that just because we're going through time and aging doesn't mean that, healing is necessarily going to be linear, right? There's ups and downs. But hopefully, when we do have our downs, it's not as low as before. I think that's like, the idea. You want to go up and down, up and down, up and down, but don't necessarily want to go back to that baseline. And if you do happen to, well, you now have the tools to bounce yourself right back up, right? Um,
Yeah.
so thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I learned so much. I learned so much from this, and I'm so thankful that you were here, and I honestly cannot wait to have you on again. Because this was
Yeah. Thank
amazing.
you so much for letting me be here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, I feel like you're gonna really help a lot of people through this episode. And real quick, if there are any survivors listening, what is the name of the organization that helped you get out of the life, so that if they're listening, they know where to go?
Yes. So the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, they help female identifying survivors in and out of the life. I think that's really important, because they'll meet you where you're at. So if you're still in the life, they provide, condoms, like safe sex things, like different resources and stuff, so you could feel safe. And a lot of times too, just having that support and knowing that there's people who are going to meet you where you're at and then help you on your goals to get into another space. That's definitely been one of the good things about the transformation. And they also partner with a lot of different organizations. And sometimes, like for me, for instance, in the space where I'm at now that I've been out of the life for 4 years, I've qualified for different organizations that help empower me to be able to do different things with my life and like complete projects and just get support. I think we all need support sometimes. And if you're feeling the stigma and shame behind it, this is like a judgment-free space. And that's what I love about them as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, how can the audience find you? And is there anything else that will help them connect more to your story and your poetry?
Yes. So I can be found on my Instagram. It's goddess_soul_speaks. That's the name of my book. It's available now on Amazon. It's 5-star rated, never duplicated. That's definitely a space where you could find me. And also I'm working on some projects that are coming up. They'll be completed soon, but I'm also looking for other survivors, not just survivors of prostitution, but domestic violence, homelessness, addiction, even eating disorders, like whatever you survived. I feel like collectively our voices need to be heard, because when we're heard, we could change the world, right? A lot of the things that I've experienced is from a lack of empathy and understanding. And so when you kind of listen to someone else's story and get their perspective on it, that you not only make them human again, but then you could kind of understand their struggle and stuff. So I'm also, you could reach out to me there and on my email, goddesssoulspeaks@gmail.com, because I got some projects coming up that are really exciting. And yes, thank you so much, Lajoie, for having me in this space. Like, I appreciate you.
Yeah, girl, I appreciate you too. This was beautiful. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to listen and facilitate the sharing of your story that I know is going to help thousands, if not millions of people. So thank you so much.